Welcome to St David's, the smallest city in the United Kingdom. Roughly the size of a large village, and home to just over 1,000 people, St David's is certainly no modern metropolis, but it's absolutely filled to the brim with history, best known as the final resting place of St David himself, the patron saint of Wales. But there's plenty more to this city too, and on this walk around St David's, we'll admire the city's mighty cathedral, explore the immense Gothic ruins of the medieval Bishop's Palace, and stroll along the handful of streets where the citizens of St David's live, lined with an array of beautiful cottages, historic taverns, and more. All of that is to come over the next half hour. But we begin our walk taking in a view of what is without doubt one of Britain's most beautiful cathedrals of all. This is St David's Cathedral, an immense place of worship with a history stretching back as many as 1400 years. The story of the cathedral began all the way back in the 6th century AD, when this site on the very southwestern tip of Wales was chosen by St David to establish a monastery. According to tradition, David was born around the year 500 AD in the small clifftop chapel of St Non, located just under a mile from here, the place where his monastery was founded, and which would later grow into one of Britain's great medieval shrines. David is said to have died on the 1st of March 589 AD, a date still marked in Wales today as St David's Day. Having gained great fame for his religious teachings and many miracles performed during his life, in the centuries following his death, David gained a faithful, almost cult-like following, which culminated in his canonization, becoming a saint, at the request of the Pope in the year 1123. This spread the word of St David even further across Europe, and the place where he was buried, here, became a place of international pilgrimage. In response to this newfound level of fame, it was decided that an immense new cathedral would be constructed to house St David's tomb, and that is the building that we see today, completed more than 800 years ago. Today, St David's stands as the largest cathedral in all of Wales, situated in its own little district of the city, and historically guarded by the large stone gatehouse that we can see up above. This area is known as the Cathedral Close, surrounded by walls and physically separated from the rest of the city of St David's. You'll also notice that the cathedral sits at the bottom of a large hill, one side of a valley through which the local river Alun flows, as we'll see in a moment. Now this was a conscious decision. St David chose to establish a monastery here, not just because it was near his birthplace, but it was also hoped that by hiding the religious community at the bottom of a valley, then it would be overlooked by Saxon raiders from the east. Ultimately, that side of the plan was far from a success. The monastery here was ransacked at least 7 times by the Saxons, and subsequently as many as 10 times by the Vikings too. In order to better protect the monastery, when the Normans arrived in the 11th century, they built a small fort and a stone wall to surround what became the Cathedral Close, which today is home to much more than just one cathedral. In front of us here, we can see the sprawling ruins of the medieval Bishop's Palace, the place where the Bishop of St David's lived and worked. Situated on the opposite bank of the River Alun from the cathedral, the Bishop's Palace was designed to rival the grandeur of St David's Cathedral, replacing a fairly unspectacular stone house which had previously been used by the bishop. Over 2 decades between 1328 and 1347, the house was transformed into this colossal official residence by then Bishop Henry de Gower. Among all of his work, the most recognisable part of the Bishop's Palace stands right in front of us here, the Great Hall, distinguished by the huge wheel window, which remains intact on one of its ruined walls. At the Great Hall, the bishop would host great ceremonies and banquets for esteemed figures visiting St David's as pilgrims, with everybody from fellow religious leaders to kings and queens taking a trip to this sacred place at least once in their lifetimes. With the completion of the palace, the cathedral close here reached its peak as a centre of religious power, intellect and wealth, situated in a strategically crucial part of the country. Here, in the shadow of the closest two main landmarks, we see the trickling waters of the shallow river Alun, a short waterway which flows across the very southwestern tip of Wales here. Looking at a map, here we can see just where St David's is located, on the very tip of the county of Pembrokeshire, and significantly just 50 miles across the sea from the island of Ireland. Because of this, St David's held not only religious significance, but strategic value, as a common crossing point between Wales, Ireland and England, visited by thousands of travellers each year, and a potential target for an enemy army seeking to gain a footing in the region. It was also for this reason that the Normans sought to beef up the protection of the cathedral close in the 11th century, while a succession of medieval English monarchs continued to visit this place as their influence across Wales grew. But as we can see from the now ruined structure of the Bishop's Palace, St David's time as one of Britain's most influential religious centres didn't last forever. So what happened? Well, as we take a look inside the Bishop's Palace itself, which is nowadays open to explore for visitors, the city's fall from grace came a couple of centuries after this immense palace was completed, during the Reformation of the 16th century. After King Henry VIII split with the Vatican and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, historic religious institutions across England and Wales immediately felt the impact. Henry launched the dissolution of the monasteries campaign, closing down all of the country's monasteries, including the one here at St David's. Meanwhile, pilgrimages from across Europe began to fall out of fashion, only hurting income for those living and working here. And newly appointed English bishops were increasingly uninterested with this city so far away from their homes. In fact, in 1536, the Bishop William Barlow even decided to sell off the lead from the roof of the bishop's palace. Soon after, in 1542, the Bishop of St David's official residence was moved away to the village of Abergwili, about 40 miles away from here, close to the town of Carmarthen. And so, with no bishop, no monks, and far fewer pilgrims, the once great St David's began to fall into a sharp decline. Over the following centuries, the bishop's palace was abandoned, and the cathedral suffered severe damage when it was attacked and looted by the troops of Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s. However, since then, St David's Cathedral has been on a steady road to recovery. As we now venture inside the building, a series of restorations over the past couple of centuries have helped to bring this historic place of worship back to its original grandeur. And just here, we find one of the cathedral's most recently renovated features, the atmospheric Cloisters. Reopened in 2008, this fetching part of the cathedral complex offers an unrivalled view of the building's mighty stone tower, which dates from around the year 1250. It was actually the second tower built for the cathedral, its predecessor having actually collapsed around 30 years prior. As for the cloisters here, they are the last remains of the medieval College of St Mary, a religious institution which formed part of the monastery, and which was established around the year 1365. Coinciding roughly with the city's peak, after the completion of the bishop's palace, the college here was used to house the college master and 7 fellows, who were responsible for administering and maintaining the standards of the cathedral. Now, during St David's heyday, this was no major challenge, but when the city began to decline during the Reformation, it quickly became extremely difficult to finance the cathedral's upkeep, and St Mary's College here fell into ruin by the turn of the 17th century. It was only in the 1960s that the cloisters were eventually renovated and in some places rebuilt, with a collection of halls and rooms now used by those working at the cathedral, situated inside the footprint of the historic college. But having now made our way out of the cloisters, we can once again admire the fetching architecture which makes up St David's Cathedral. As we mentioned, the last 250 years or so have seen a series of restorations take place to repair the damage and neglect the cathedral suffered, and the building today features stonework from a variety of different eras, some original 13th century architecture standing side by side with 19th and 20th century repairs. However, it's not just the cathedral where you can find the original medieval stonework. If we look up the slope just here, for instance, we'll be able to spot the historic stone wall which surrounds the cathedral close, this one dating from around the time of the 14th century. The wall, which links up with the large bell tower and gatehouse that we can see up above, was built not just as a defence against attacks, but also to separate the historic cathedral close here from the growing civilian settlement just outside. The settlement which gave birth to the city of St David's that we know today. With so many people flocking here either as pilgrims or travelling onwards towards Ireland, an array of guest houses, shops and inns popped up on the perimeter of the historic cathedral close, and in a few moments we'll make our way onto the streets that developed as more and more people began moving here permanently. But as we mentioned, this city is in all truth no much bigger than a large village, with a population of little more than 1,300 people. So the question has to be asked, why on earth is St David's a city? Well, this brings us into the wonderfully complex world of what exactly it means to be a city in the UK, which is different to many other countries around the world. And a lot of it has to do with the cathedral that stands just behind us now. As we reach the top of the stairs, we see the imposing gate which separates the cathedral close from the rest of St David's, known as the Porth-y-twr, or the Tower Gatehouse. It was built back in the 14th century, and it's actually the last remaining of what were once 4 stone gates which provided access into the cathedral close here. Historically, the heart of the city of St David's. Because while we normally think of a city as a place where lots of people live, once upon a time it was not population which defined a city in this country, but simply the presence of a diocesan cathedral, the seat of a bishop, like St David's here. Fundamentally, the existence of the historic cathedral is the reason that St David's, home to fewer people than even some villages around the country, is recognised as a city. But as we now make our way outside of the cathedral close for the first time, things are a little more complicated than that. Initially, when construction began on the cathedral in the late 12th century, St David's was granted city status. Now at this time the settlement consisted almost solely of the cathedral close and a smattering of farms outside, and while more people did begin settling here over time, the population never reached higher than 2,000 people. Still, with its cathedral, St David's indisputably remained a city. That is, until the landscape of British life began to change during the era of the Industrial Revolution. Historically small settlements with no cathedrals, like Birmingham in England for instance, rapidly grew into huge industrial metropolises, and it became apparent that the simple criteria of having a cathedral to be recognised as a city were simply becoming outdated. For this reason, the criterion was abolished in the 1880s, and St David's actually lost the right to call itself a city. Despite this, locals just kept calling St David's a city, and eventually, in 1994, more than a century after it lost city status, Queen Elizabeth II granted it back to St David's, in recognition of its historic status. So that's why St David's exists as the smallest city in the UK today, and here we find ourselves on the city's main square, at the very heart of the modern settlement. Flying proudly above the square is the Welsh flag, instantly recognisable for its red dragon, known in Welsh as y Ddraig Goch. But you might be surprised to hear that the red dragon has only been Wales's official flag since 1959, and it's actually one of a number which have been used to represent the country through time. Another Welsh flag in existence is the flag of St David, a yellow cross on a black field which represents the nation's patron saint, and by extension the diocese and city of St David's here too. But today the red dragon flies high atop the flagpole which stands at the heart of the city's memorial garden, dedicated to those from St David's who fought in the 2 World Wars. But the memorial garden stands just below the city's historic centre point, known as Cross Square for the medieval artefact that we find just here. This is the city's historic market cross, denoting the point where local markets were traditionally held. Now at its oldest, the cross is made up of stonework dating back more than 600 years to the 14th century. The oldest parts of the cross are the main shaft and stone at its bottom, while the head of the Celtic cross, along with the stepped pedestal on which it stands, date from a more recent restoration. Some say that the original 14th century head of the cross is actually still in existence, set into a stone wall about 30 miles away from here, just outside the town of Cardigan, though how and why it could have ended up there remains a mystery. Surrounding Cross Square in the middle of the city, meanwhile, is a collection of shops, houses and historic taverns, including the Bishop's just here. Despite being located just a short distance from the Bishop's Palace, the pub here actually takes its name from another source, a group of rocks which are located a couple of miles off the coast of St David's and which are known as the Bishop's. This southwestern part of Pembrokeshire is well known for the crags and cliffs of its spectacular coastline, and from the city centre you can take a walk to the coast for yourself by following Goat Street just here, which leads towards the cliffs overlooking St Non's Bay, where you'll also find the ruins of St Non's Chapel, the reputed birthplace of St David himself. It's about a 20-minute walk from here to the coast, and although we won't have time to venture out there today, just here we find a 19th century barometer, which introduces us to this city's association with the sea. This gadget, which is traditionally used by locals to forecast the weather and the potential for rough waves out at sea, belongs to the RNLI, who operate a lifeboat station just a short distance away from the city centre here. As this part of the Welsh coast pokes out quite far into the sea, it's a part of the country which has seen plenty of shipwrecks over time, with many vessels approaching from the Atlantic being caught out by the many hidden rocks beneath the water here. The local lifeboat station was eventually established back in 1869, and since then has been responsible for saving the lives of more than 300 people caught in difficulty out at sea here. Crossing over onto the other side of Cross Square, meanwhile, behind the trees there stands one of the larger inns in the city centre, the Cross Hotel, which has the best part of 200 years of history under its belt. The hotel began life around the turn of the 19th century as a thatched roof house, but in 1887 it was converted into a hotel, then known as the Old Cross. The building that we see today, however, is a rebuild dating from the mid-20th century, and it today serves as the central inn for the many visitors which come to stay for longer periods in St David's. Because while this may be Britain's smallest city, there's plenty to do here, and in the summer St David's can get quite busy indeed. Now we're here later in the afternoon, but as we admire this beautiful fountain, placed on Cross Square back in 1912, the many historic landmarks of the city centre and the Cathedral Close are far from the only attractions that St David's offers. Surrounding the city is a truly gorgeous natural landscape, with the cliffs, rocks and beaches of the Pembrokeshire coastline complemented by hills and quaint villages that make this one of the most beautiful areas in all of Wales, and St David's is probably the best place to base yourself if you're keen to explore it all on an epic hiking holiday. With a handful of delightful shops, the visitor centre, a few restaurants, and of course historic taverns catering to locals and tourists alike, Little St David's is full of life. But so far we've focused a lot on what life here has been like in centuries past. So how about the modern day? Well, as we know, St David's today has a permanent population of just over 1,300 people. And despite retaining the atmosphere of a beautiful rural village, this is very much a city. In fact, just here on the High Street, there stands St David's City Hall, the meeting place of the City Council and a focal point for the local community. Originally built in 1924 to provide a more spacious home for the local government, the City Hall is today home to a pair of halls, a public library, a youth centre, and the pleasantly named Shop a Bobble, a charity shop run by local volunteers. As well as serving locals, the modern City Hall has also played host to a number of distinguished guests. In 1981, famously greeting Charles and Diana, then Prince and Princess of Wales, on the 800th anniversary of St David's Cathedral. The following year, meanwhile, Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip came to St David's, although this wasn't their first visit. Interestingly, Elizabeth II had visited St David's a few decades earlier in 1955, and that was far more than just a quick hello, because it made her the first British monarch to visit St David's Cathedral since the Reformation brought about its lengthy period of decline. It was during those visits that the Queen was able to gain a closer understanding of local history, and it was almost certainly a factor in her finally restoring city status to St David's in 1994. Now though, you'll have noticed that we've turned off St David's High Street and onto New Street, which, as the name suggests, is one of the city's newer streets. While many people did settle on the outskirts of the Cathedral Close during the city's late medieval heyday, the civilian city of St David's never covered a particularly large area. In the years after the Reformation in the 16th century, the city barely changed, with the exception of New Street here, which was laid out in the 18th century, and provided more space for homes near the city's historic core. Otherwise, the centre of St David's as we see it today follows roughly the same layout as it did more than 500 years ago. In the 20th century, modern housing estates, new schools, and other developments took place on the fringes of the city centre, on land historically used for agriculture. And so today St David's does occupy a slightly larger footprint than it once did, although it still remains characteristically small. As for New Street, it's lined mostly by houses, some of which are also used as shops and galleries. But set back from the street just here, we find one of St David's many churches, this being the local Seion Baptist Chapel, which was originally built back in 1843. Also incorporating a schoolroom, where many of the city's children were educated back in the early 20th century, the chapel is one of a number of small civilian places of worship, which were built to cater to a wider range of religious denominations, which became increasingly common across Wales in the Victorian era. At that time, St David's Cathedral was the main Anglican place of worship in the city, but today you'll find Catholic, Baptist and independent places of worship dotted around the city's streets. We'll talk more about that when we stumble across another small local chapel in a few moments' time. But just here we're going to make our way off New Street and along a narrow lane between the houses, known as Peter's Lane, or Veder Peder in Welsh. Now, who exactly the Peter that this lane is named after isn't clear. It's likely that it was simply the name of a man who lived on the lane, which links New Street with the much older Nun Street. Now today this narrow lane, which is bursting with colour from the bushes, is home to a small group of houses, and a couple of galleries, where you can take a glimpse at local artwork, much of which of course depicts the beautiful landscape that surrounds this city. The John Rogers Gallery here, for example, has been open since 1972, and it showcases the works of the local artist, John Rogers, to visitors from all over the world. As we've mentioned, there are plenty of hidden gems to find on the handful of streets and lanes that make up St David's beyond the Cathedral Close, whether that be in the form of galleries or stories of the people who've lived in the houses that line the streets today. At the end of this colourful row of houses on Nun Street, a blue plaque commemorates the notable Welsh language poet Waldo Williams, who stayed at this address between 1949 and 1951, when it was used as a hotel. Waldo, a native of the nearby town of Haverfordwest, was one of the 20th century's leading Welsh language writers, and he penned a wide collection of poems which represented local people and life in this part of Pembrokeshire, an area of Wales with rich heritage wherever you visit. In the century before his career, religion was a key part of day-to-day life in this region. And here we find the Ebenezer Congregational Chapel, which was built in 1871 and which stands as yet another of the city's diverse range of places of worship. Of course, none of these chapels are quite as enormous as St David's Cathedral, but of course the population in the late 19th century was still far from large, likely hovering around 1,000 people. And as a result, only a group of humbly sized places of worship were needed for those who formed part of other religious denominations. And while the population has of course grown since then, it's only done so by a few hundred people, meaning that many of the facilities built around St David's more than a century ago are still able to be used by the local population. Of course, that's not anything especially unusual in this historic city. A large bulk of the houses that you'll find here, and that surround us on Nun Street now, are well over 100 years old, each with their own captivating histories. Just here, for example, we're passing by the distinctive Milton Halls, a large stone house that dates from the mid to late 19th century. The house once belonged to the minister of the Congregational chapel that we just saw, and it was even once known as a part of the so-called nunnery, which some say may be the reason for the name of this street. Nun Street here has historically been the main road leading north-east out of the heart of St David's, today connecting the city with towns further up the coast, such as Fishguard and Cardigan. But despite its name, no real evidence of a nunnery of any kind has been found here, and there's every chance that the name derives instead from the chapel of St Non, or St Non's Bay, just a short distance to the south of this city. Whatever the truth, Nun Street is now home to some of the oldest civilian residences in St David's, many of its stone cottages harking back to the days just before the city was reinvigorated by restoration work, and the return of tourism. As we mentioned, tourism today is one of the leading industries in St David's, tour operators in the city even offering boat trips out into the sea to visit neighbouring islands, like Ramsay Island, and to get a glimpse of local sea life, with plenty of seals, seabirds and more to see out on the water. If you're staying in Pembrokeshire for an extended period of time, it's well worth venturing out to sea on one of the many cruises on offer for tourists. But as we mentioned earlier, we unfortunately won't have time to make our way down to the coast today, because we're reaching the end of our walk around St David's. So from the sight of the Welsh flag flying high over Cross Square, we're now going to make our way back into the Cathedral Close, along the street with the loveliest name in the city. Lined by a collection of independent shops, homes and more in a group of fetching stone houses, this is the Pebbles, or Popples in Welsh. The quaintly named street leads directly from Cross Square towards the Tower Gatehouse, and it possibly takes its name from the fact that it was once paved with cobblestones, over which pilgrims by the hundreds traversed the last few yards of their epic journey to the shrine of St David. The sight of the cathedral tower hoving into view would have been a moment of immense joy for pilgrims who'd voyaged here from hundreds, even thousands of miles away. But as impressive as it is, the cathedral isn't the only landmark worth noting in this view. In the distance behind it, a large hill stands prominently above the surrounding landscape. It's Carn Llydli, a rocky hill which stands nearly 600 feet tall, and which offers some of the very best views in the region, if you take a hike up to the top. Not only is the whole of this city easily visible from atop the hill, but if you turn your attention out to sea, on a clear day, you'll also be able to spot the mountains of County Wicklow in Ireland, a good 50 miles across St George's Channel. That puts into perspective just how close we are to the Emerald Isle in this southwestern corner of Wales, and why so many people through the centuries came to St David's to make their way across the sea. But of course this city began life with St David himself, and so as we enter the cathedral close once again, it's with his final resting place that our walk reaches a fitting conclusion. Far more than just a geographical quirk, Britain's smallest city here is a place of immense historical significance and true beauty, making it without doubt one of the very best places to visit and explore in all of Wales. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to making your own trip to St David's sometime soon.